So, I'm reasonably pleased with the position it's in just now. I had started out thinking I would try and find the closest snap points, but I changed my mind and decided to draw the guides first, and I'm pretty pleased the grid works, and there are another couple of types of guide I'll have to draw for the other types of snap point. At the moment, this is the section of the finish draw method of the work zone gadget that draws the grid, and immediately after that I will say if project length snap and if project angle snap. Similarly to the grid snap, the length and angle guides, I will just for the time being have them only appear when the snapping is activated. And I have more or less an idea. I have this pen, it's quite unreliable, let's see. More or less an idea about how I want the appearance of the guides to look. Let's say that this is the selected point and the both angle and length snapping is activated. So what I'd like to see is some marks along this line, similar marks along this line. So these are snap points. But also, let's say that angle guides are also activated at 45 degrees, say. I want to see guides here drawn dimly. This is very beautiful, yeah, 45 degrees. Drawn from these points which are adjacent to the selected point, this being the selected point. Possibly just radiating in all directions for simplicity. The length guides could be circular. That would have a benefit. Or I could draw the length guides as part of the actual segment. I am going to have to change the way that my segments are drawn anyway, so maybe that is a wise thing to do, but for the time being I think I'm going to go for circles for the length and lines for the angles. Now, what does that actually mean? I'm going to have a version of it running so that I can see. What does it mean? It means that similarly for the grid, I have to decide the positions of some lines. I'm going to remove some of these points for simplicity. And I'll stop it animating for simplicity. If this was the selected corner, the length guides would be drawn concentric to this point and this point, and the angle guides would radiate from those points. So, if the length snapping is activated, I have a couple of other reference variables which are called covered and selected vert, which are not very good names, but the verts refer to the spots on the screen basically. They could be a corner, they do really define the corners, but actually when you see them work they're points on a path. It's not worth going into those details. Really all I want to think about is the lines emanating from the points. This is actually trickier than I think. Let me have a look at it. Because if I do add an animation point to this, and then I move this point, this is it going to be the point that it radiates from? This is a trickiness. Because really, yeah, now I have to think about it again. It's like I'm defining the control points according to the guides. I have to bear this in mind. So it's only the position of the curve, or the control points of the curve, at certain points during the animation. Like if I add another control point, if that was... oh, this is a problem. Now that I consider it again, if this was the setup, and I want to grab this point and have it lock so that the lines are adhering to the snapping rules, they adhere for this section. No, they're the control points. I'm so sorry again, I apologise, I'm thinking about it. Like if I grab this point, it would be adhering to the rules snapping here, here and here. My problem is, what... grabbing this will make it adhere to rules. Like which actual angle and length rules is this point having to adhere to? Technically it's this point and this point. They are before and after this corner. Is that right? No, this point and this point. These ones are before and after this corner. Moving this point, its angle and length restraints are based on these 2 points. But I might be able to simplify this in my mind if I actually make these, one of these at least, animate after, animate as well. So at this point in the it's really tricky. I can lock the control points to a grid. That's easy because the grid doesn't change. But locking the control points relative to the 2 adjacent points is more difficult because the 2 adjacent points change depending on the position inside the animation. This is a thing I just hadn't considered, and this is why this is incompetent coding. I'm thinking this through as I speak about it. So, but let me have a little think, because maybe I can still do this. My first instinct when I think about this is, wow, maybe this is actually not quite possible and I might be restricted to grid locking only, grid snapping only. But maybe not. Let me see. At any point I'm drawing the curve at a certain position of its animation. The control points don't change position when I change the position of the animation, because the control points determine the position of the ultimate curve. In the case of an entirely static curve, it's simple because those corners never move. Like if I place the position of the curve at the start, then I could make a decision based on that. This position, like then it doesn't make sense to do that. Like what I'm thinking is, this is the curve at the start of the animation, position 0, and this control point must be the start of this loop because that's where the curve meets that loop at that point. And this control point is obviously the start of this loop because that's where the curve meets the loop at that point. If I use those values, these are also at the initial position of the loop, animation. Obviously they don't move. If I use those values, I can snap to them. I could snap to the angle and the lengths. But that's never going to make sense if this is drawn here, because where this is going to want to snap to is going to be relative to this point here. And it's complicated even further. If I'm moving this, if the control point is what's snapping, then I'm snapping the position at the beginning of the animation. I think I have to make it relative to the... No, I can't even do that, really. Oh my goodness me, you know what this is? This is really horrible to do this. Because I feel actually, if I'm moving this, this is the point that I want to be determining the position of in the snapping. So that what I'm really saying when I move this is, and I'm telling it to adhere to snapping rules, is I'm saying at this point in the animation I want this line to adhere to the rule. Now I have, obviously, this curve as it is defined at this point in the animation in the memory. I'm drawing it. I'm figuring it every frame to draw it. So I could do things that would determine the nearest control point to this point, nearest snap point to this point. But then if I make it snap to it, if I make that point snap to it, I actually need to figure the position of this point. Oh, and that is not good. Because then, dragging this, when this snaps, this leaps out from underneath my mouse cursor. Mind you, that's what happens with snapping anyway. Let me think again. I could probably deal with that maybe, but the main problem is I don't know, say in this situation, as I drag this, and this snaps, say to anything, a grid corner. That's not the way I want that to work, but anyway, let's say to a grid corner. This pops out from under my mouse pointer, but that's okay because as I drag it away, it pops back under my mouse pointer as this moves out of the radius of the snap zone. This is not good. But my main problem is, even if I could get this to snap to the nearest restraint, I don't know how I redefine the position of this point. What am I really saying? Let's say this does snap. I'm saying the new curve has to pass through here and here and here, and this point has to be moved to a position that makes that happen. What is that? And I'm realizing as I describe this, maybe what I'm just talking about sounds really, I'm probably describing it in such a way that's really more confusing. But this is what I have to think through. This is the problem. Because the curve can be displayed at any point in the frame, in the animation, it's not completely logical to just snap these points. It's like to snap these control points to the corners. This is me restating the problem, sorry. It's more like I'm saying I want to edit the curve at this position in the frame. At this position in the frame, I want to be able to decide what shape the curve is. And if I'm saying at this position in the frame, I want to be able to decide the shape of the curve, these points are the point. This point is the point that needs to do the snapping. This one, and I can illustrate further by adding more control points, making the whole thing even more confusing. And I'll just do it for fun. But these intermediate points between the beginning and end of each animation point are the ones that need to snap. I'm beginning to formalize this in my mind a bit. Snapping these points, not really relevant. In the case of a corner, technically, well, according to my code, these parts are okay, I'll describe it properly. A vertex in the overall curve and its animation path is a corner, defined as a corner, because it is like a corner in the maximum in the simplest curve described. A vert, in my code, is an individual control point on that corner. And a corner, which possesses only one vert, like this one, looks like this, and at any point in the animation, it appears in the same place. So in the situation where a corner has one path vert, its position is always at that vert. It's so clumsy for me to say that, but my point is, when the curve passes into that vert at the point in the animation, the vert will appear to snap to the guides. That sounds really tedious to explain, but it means that actually I think this would be more intuitive than it would seem to have these intersection points be the parts that snap, because in the instances where where it passes right through the point will snap. It'll be very odd to look at this, but on the other hand, to look at this part doing the snapping and this part leaping out from underneath your mouse as you move it around, but it will hopefully be apparent because the guidelines that the line will be snapping to, this line will be snapping to, will be passing through the intersections and concentric around the intersections of these green lines, these path lines, elsewhere in the curve. Now, yeah, I think that's right. So it's so that what you're really determining is the shape of the curve at a point in time. Yeah, you're determining the shape of the curve at a point in time. What happens though if I want a control point as opposed to a point like this where it's really like controlling the whole corner? I want this to snap to, say, a grid position. Will the grid position always be okay? The grid position never changes. Yeah, okay, this is okay, because I'm thinking that defining the path would be nice if I could lock it entirely to a grid, and I'm worrying that my scheme of doing all this, like this, where I am judging the guides by these sort of computed animation position corners. Boy oh boy. Okay, I'm talking a lot about this and not doing a lot of coding, and I'm already at 20 minutes, but this has been good in a way because I need to consider this when altering a control point. It's the current animation position. It's that point that's doing the snapping. Okay. So, if I was moving this... Oh, actually, yeah, no, the grid as well. It's snapping it to the grid. Oh, gosh. Yeah, no, the same, it does have this problem. If I do this thing where I'm defining it such that the snapping applies to the current position of the corner in the animation as opposed to the control point, that is where a grid snap is. That is where a grid snap is. And that is where a grid snap is. Even if I'm at the start of the frame, this is a setup at the start of the frame, all the points are in their initial positions. But even if I'm at the start of the frame, well, actually that control point is, yeah, but if I'm at the start of a frame and I grab another control point, at the moment it's hard to see because of my bad color choice. Actually, I can improve that slightly. At the moment, because the position is at 0 in the animation, the curve passes straight through the first control point of this path. And really, according to the rules I've just defined, whenever I pick up this point is going to try to move to the nearest snap point, which is maybe here. So grabbing this makes this jump to there. That's not what I want to happen. I want grabbing this to leap to a grid, its nearest grid point. Because at any point in the path, I think that I want to be able to define the position of the path more simply. What is that contradicting with? It's contradicting with the fact that at any point in the path, like here, maybe I want grabbing this to snap to the grid, rather than have this snap to the grid. I mean, actually it's still technically right. And that what really I should do if I want to change the position of this point in the path is move until, I mean it's not even accurate enough, move until the curve, move the position of the animation until the curve passes through that actual point. That is what I should technically do, because then, you know, I'm defining the shape of the curve at that point in time. And under any other circumstances, like I move this to here and I move this point, I'm still trying to change the shape of the curve at this point in time. This is what will leap to there. That's very unintuitive to me when I imagine it. And I don't think I can do it that way, but what's the option? Like, the other option is that points, whenever you grab them, go to their nearest grid point, but it begs the question, do they go to their nearest grid point, their own nearest grid point? Like, do I make the grid restraint work differently to the length and angle restraint? I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I can do that. I suppose the alternative is oh gosh, okay. Let me think again. Yeah, the problem with making the control points as opposed to the point in time lock is that, yeah, you're defining the shape of the path and not the actual I suppose the alternative, there is an alternative, which is that I add another set of controls and I make them at the actual corner. Oh, that's really unpleasant, isn't it? Isn't it? Because then I could grab that. Well, then I could grab that, and it would act like it just has done. No, it wouldn't. That added a point, which is correct. But if I could actually grab that and have it add a control point in this line, that would effectively be... no, that does not work either. It really doesn't. The time spent between each control point is equal as the animation plays. So adding a control point here, like at this moment, 1/3 the way through the animation, or 1, 2, 3, a sixth of the way through the animation, about halfway between these 2 points. It's hard to describe because this path has 3 sections and this path effectively has 2, there and back again. Adding a point here would change the position. Like if I added a point to this path, you will see it didn't do it. Right, I'm talking through this and talking through it and realizing that I'm not getting closer to understanding what I need to do. I mean, it seems easy that I could make the control points just lock to the corners, but I'm just creating a really strange situation where the actual shape of the curve is off somewhere else. When, yeah, it's the shape of the curve that I'm wanting to say adheres to the rules, not the position of the control points necessarily. Sometimes the position of the control points I want to adhere to the rules. Sometimes the position of the line I want to adhere to the rules. This is a problem, isn't it? Like when it's the length and angle, I think it's the line. When it's the grid, sometimes it's the control points, or sometimes it's the line. That's the distinction, isn't it? Like, maybe I want to be controlling the direction of this path, or maybe I want to be controlling the position of the end of this line. Is it the case that I'm going to have to build in an extra option which says what does the grid size restraint apply to? I don't like it because it's not intuitive, like it doesn't immediately leap out. And is it another distinction, like that distinction between restraining the control points or restraining the curve at this point in the animation, that could apply to the grid, the length and the angle restraints? Like with the grid it seems obvious because there might be times I want to say I want the path to pass through exactly these points. The angle and length are not so obvious because let's say if I was saying I want this point to adhere to the length snapping, what is it actually snapping relative to? Because this means the position of this corner at such and such point in the animation, at the very start of the animation. So if I'm saying when I drag this, I want it to adhere to angle and length locking, snapping, I don't mean relative to this position. That's the position of the curve at this point in the frame. This is the position of the curve at that point in the frame. excuse me. So if I'm sorry about this. If I grab this and say adhere to length and angle locking, shouldn't it pop in around about here? Say it was 45 degrees angle locking, because this is the point of this corner at the same time as this corner. They adhere. That's the point at the beginning of the animation. So what's it going to be like if the position of the animation is here and I grab this corner? It's going to be adhering to the locking rules against this point in this path. Like if I made the guides activate whenever you clicked on a corner, then when I clicked on this, a guide would appear there, and a guide would appear here or somewhere. Yeah, I think it's there. Because this is the point in the next adjacent corner that coincides with this point at the time of the animation. This point, and this point, ping, are all at the start of the animation. And to make it even more complicated, the slight extra complication is that if I move forward to here, this doesn't even have a point on the line, a control point on the path at this stage of the animation. This path has 3 control points, this only has 2. So and although this loops, so it goes there and back again, each stage of that takes half the time. Each stage of this takes a third of the time. So at this control point, there's no control point here to line the guides up with. They'll just appear. And if it's at a different time position and I move to this control point, lines will just appear right there in the middle of that line. And it's as if I'm trying to imply to the user, oh yes, you're controlling this control point. These are the rules that it adheres to. It's here and here or somewhere. No, here. Boy, oh boy. Okay, let me have a little look at this. Because that's 32 minutes and all I've done is talk about how I'm going to manage. But I am going to make some notes and call it a video there, because it's been tedious but useful. So a quick note is, and I put it before because this sort of applies to both, or maybe it applies to all. If you're moving, no, actually, now I think it does. I think this thing mainly applies to the length and angle constraints, because if I'm thinking about it right now, when I move these points, they should move to the grid constraints, because it's like I am saying, yeah, I want to move these. Yeah, the grid constraints, the angle constraints, and the length constraints can all act on this point, as long as the angle and length constraints are displayed from the position in the other paths that the line would be in at this point, regardless of the position of the curve where it's being drawn at the moment. So, according to this little scheme, I can leave the grid as it is for now and just make a little note about how length and angle constraints are applied relative to the corners adjacent to the selection at the point in the animation occupied by the selected vert adjacent to the selected corner. Length and angle constraints are applied relative to the corners adjacent to the selected corner at the point in the animation occupied by the selected vert. That basically, I think, sums up what I want to do. That way the vert is the thing that snaps as you move it around, so it can snap to the grid, the length and the angle constraints. Fine. Now, like every time, I've thought about that. I think I'm kind of right about the way it should work. I'll start to code it, I'll make a load of mistakes, and probably I'll find out in the end I was wrong about the way it should work. But that's for next time. At least this time I've written 3 little lines that describe what I want to do. Okay.